On a freezing beach at the bottom of South America, in October of 1741, armed British sailors dragged their own captain from his tent, bound his hands, and charged him with murder. 4 days later, 81 of them sailed away in a rebuilt longboat and left him on an uninhabited island off Patagonia. History remembers it as the Voyages Mutiny. At least, that's what everyone has called it for 3 centuries. Because when the Navy finally got these men into a courtroom, nobody was tried for mutiny. Nobody was tried for murder. And that was not an oversight. The Voyager was never built for any of this. She was built to carry cargo. She began her life as an East Indiaman, a fat-bellied merchant ship hauling trade goods between London and India, and when the Royal Navy bought her in 1739, they wanted her for exactly one reason: that deep hold. They mounted 28 guns on her, rated her a 6th-rate warship, and packed her with the supplies an entire squadron would need on the far side of the world: spare rigging, siege equipment, brandy, and trade goods for the coast of Chile, the floating warehouse of the expedition. Every man in the squadron depended on what was stacked in her hold. Keep that in mind, because the ship bought to keep 2,000 men alive was about to strand her own crew with almost nothing. Britain had just declared war on Spain, a conflict remembered by the strange name of the War of Jenkins' Ear, and the Admiralty wanted to hit the Spanish Empire where it kept its money. In September of 1740, a squadron under Commodore George Anson sailed from England with secret orders. Round Cape Horn, raid the undefended Pacific coast of South America, and if fortune allowed, take the Spanish treasure galleon that crossed from Acapulco to Manila every year. 6 warships, roughly 2,000 men, and the Voyager trailing behind them like a pack mule with cannons. Spain knew they were coming. Spanish agents had watched the squadron fitting out in Portsmouth for months, and a Spanish force under Admiral Pizarro put to sea to hunt Anson down before he ever reached the Pacific. So the race to Cape Horn was run by 2 fleets at once, one chasing the other into the worst ocean on the planet, and the sea would end up killing more men than either navy managed to. The men they sent tell you everything about how this voyage would end. Britain was short of sailors, so the Admiralty filled out the expedition with invalid pensioners from the Royal Hospital at Chelsea, veterans in their 60s and 70s. Some carried up the gangways on stretchers. Men who could walk deserted before the ships left. Men who couldn't sailed. Aboard the Voyager, Captain Dandy Kidd died of fever before the squadron even reached Cape Horn, and he was said to have warned, near the end, that the voyage would finish in poverty, vermin, famine, and death. The record of that warning comes from survivors writing years later, so treat it as memory, not prophecy. Either way, the man who replaced him was a Scottish officer named David Cheap, ambitious, proud, and holding his first command. He believed the Voyager was his one chance at distinction, and he would rather die than let go of it. Then the squadron met Cape Horn, and the dying began in earnest. They came around the bottom of the world in March and April of 1741, the southern autumn, the worst possible season, into the Drake Passage, where the ocean rolls unbroken around the entire planet, and the waves stack up like moving hills. Storms blew for weeks without pause. Typhus swept the crowded gun decks first. Then came scurvy, and scurvy is a slow horror. Gums swelling black over loose teeth. Decades-old wounds reopening as the body's tissue quietly came apart. Men who seemed fine at supper found dead in their hammocks at dawn. Across Anson's squadron, the voyage would eventually kill around 1,300 of the roughly 2,000 who sailed, most of them not by cannon or drowning but by disease. 2 of the warships gave up, turned around, and ran for home. The rest nearly died together in a single night. Believing they had fought far enough west to clear the continent, the squadron turned north, and instead of open ocean, the lookouts saw breakers and the black cliffs of Tierra del Fuego dead ahead in the moonlight. The navigator's reckoning was off by hundreds of miles. The current in the Drake Passage had been shoving them backward the whole time, toward the rocks, while their charts told them they were safe. They clawed off that coast by inches. It was a warning written in surf that on this coast, the ships did not actually know where they were. And in the chaos of the storms that followed, in April of 1741, the Voyager lost sight of the squadron entirely. She was now alone, undermanned, and rotting with scurvy on the most dangerous coast in the world. Her captain was barely upright. Cheap had been thrown down a hatchway in the heavy, rolling and driven his shoulder from its socket, and he spent the critical days drugged and confined below while the surgeon tended him. The one man with absolute authority aboard was flat on his back as the ship ran toward land. Cheap had his orders: make for the rendezvous off the Chilean coast. So he turned the battered ship north and east, toward land, in weather that never cleared. The Carpenter saw it coming. On the 13th of May, the ship's carpenter, John Cummins, glimpsed land to the west, which should have been impossible if the ship's position was where the officers believed. He reported it. Lieutenant Robert Baines, the officer who should have carried that warning to the captain, did nothing. Nobody altered course, and nobody told Cheap that the coast of Patagonia was reaching out for them in the dark. At 4:30 the next morning, the 14th of May, 1741, the Voyager struck. She hit a submerged rock in a body of water the Spanish had already named the Gulf of Sorrows, and the name earned itself that morning. The impact threw sick men from their hammocks into rising water. She struck again and again, driving across the reef in mountainous surf until the hull impaled itself on rocks close to an uninhabited island. What happened aboard in those hours is one of the most disturbing scenes in the whole record. Some men worked the boats and fought to save lives. Others broke open the spirit room and drank themselves senseless while the ship died under them, looting chests and pulling on officers' clothes as freezing water climbed the decks. 140 of the 160 men aboard eventually reached the shore of the island. Some of the rest drowned. Roughly a dozen stayed on the wreck with the liquor and refused to leave it, firing off a cannon and parading the flooded decks in looted lace. When the sea finally finished breaking the hull apart, their bodies came ashore with the driftwood. The survivors crawled onto a cold, rain-lashed shore of rock, peat bog, and dripping green forest, beneath a hill they would come to call Mount Misery. It rains on that coast most days of the year. Almost nothing came off the ship with them. Some casks of flour, salt beef, and dribbles as the wreck broke up, wine and brandy. On the island itself there was wild celery, shellfish on the rocks at low tide, seaweed, and almost nothing else. 140 men, no shelter, and food for a fraction of them. And within days, the survivors began asking a question that would echo all the way back to England. If the ship was gone, who exactly was still in charge? Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything that follows. A Royal Navy seaman's wages stopped on the day his ship was lost. The men on that beach knew it, and they drew the obvious conclusion. If the king stopped paying them the moment the wager died, then the king's law had died with her. In plain terms, they were arguing that naval discipline was a contract. The crown had just breached it, and a captain without a ship was only a man in a wet coat giving orders on a beach. It sounds like sea lawyer talk from starving men, and it was. It was also a genuine hole in the law, and hold on to that thought, because 5 years later, the Admiralty's own response to it would decide everyone's fate. Cheap didn't see a legal question. He saw treason forming in front of him. He posted armed guards on the salvaged provisions, cut rations to the edge of starvation, and had men flogged for theft. And he announced his plan. They would take the ship's surviving boats north, hundreds of miles up a hostile coast, seize a Spanish vessel, and rejoin Anson at the rendezvous, because his secret orders required it. What exactly those orders said, he refused to explain to the men he expected to die executing them. The gunner, John Bulkley, looked at the same map and reached the opposite answer. South, through the Strait of Magellan, and up the Atlantic coast to Portuguese Brazil, roughly 2,500 nautical miles in open boats, but away from Spanish guns, running before the prevailing winds toward friendly harbors. Bulkley was no aristocrat, just a working gunner with a Bible, a navigation manual, and a habit of writing everything down. That journal would turn out to be the sharpest weapon on the island. And for weeks, the two plans glared at each other across the beach, while the island ground the men down. The daily ration fell to a scrap of flour, and whatever the tide left on the rocks. Thieves raided the store tent at night, and the punishment for stealing food became 600 lashes, laid on in installments so the man would survive to receive all of them. A faction of hard cases simply walked out of the camp, armed, and set up on their own along the shore, beyond anyone's orders. And the hunger reached the point where sentiment starved too. Young John Byron had brought his dog through the wreck, and one day a party of famished seamen took it from him, killed it, and ate it while he watched. Weeks later, Byron went back and dug up the paws. Canoe parties of Kawaskar, the indigenous people of these channels, arrived, traded fish and mussels, watched the sailors carefully, and then vanished, reportedly after sailors interfered with their women. The one group of people who knew how to live on that coast wanted nothing to do with them. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Not a battle over the boats, a gunshot over a ration of wine. Midshipman Henry Cozens was a drinker, and drink made him loud. He had already quarreled with Cheap more than once, and been put in irons for it. and the captain had come to see him as the voice of everything insolent on that island. On the 10th of June 1741, Cousins got into a shouting match over provisions with the ship's purser, who screamed the word mutiny and fired a pistol shot past his head. Captain Cheap heard the shot and the word, and came running with a cocked pistol. He did not hold an inquiry. He did not ask a single question. He walked up to Henry Cousins, who was unarmed, put the muzzle against his cheek, and fired into his face. Cousins didn't die. That's the part the men could not forgive. He lay wounded on that freezing island while Cheap, for days, refused to let him be carried into shelter where the surgeon could properly treat him. The crew watched a shipmate lie there with a ball in his shattered face, in the rain, and understood exactly what was being demonstrated to them. It took roughly 2 weeks for Henry Cousins to die. Whatever thread of loyalty still tied the lower deck to their captain was buried in the sand with him. Bulkley wrote it down, dated it, and gathered witnesses. The shooting was a warning sign that the island had its own justice coming. Cheap ignored it. If this is your first time on Powder Monkeys, this is what we do. One story from the age of sail every time, separating what the records prove from the legend that grew over it. Subscribe if you want the next one. Enter John Cummins, the ship's carpenter, the same man whose warning could have saved the wager. Through the freezing winter, he pulled off the quiet miracle that made everything else possible. Working with salvaged timber on an open beach, he sawed the ship's longboat in half and lengthened her by roughly 12 feet. Decking her over into a little schooner the men christened the Speedwell, a crude, patched, overcrowded thing, but an actual seagoing vessel, and everyone understood what her existence meant. The moment she floated, the argument about north or south stopped being theoretical. Bulkley ran the endgame, like a man preparing a legal defense, because that is exactly what he was doing. Petitions, written resolutions, signature after signature from the crew, declaring the southern route the only path consistent with saving the king's subjects. He was building a paper wall between himself and the gallows, which, looking back, was either incredibly brave or incredibly calculating. On the 9th of October 1741, the paper turned into steel. Armed seamen rushed Captain Cheap in his tent at dawn, bound him, and told him he was their prisoner, not for resisting the voyage south, but under arrest for the murder of Henry Cousins. The world had turned fully upside down. A crew charging their own post captain with a capital crime, on an island 1,000 leagues past the reach of any court. They intended to carry him to England for trial. In the end, they didn't even do that. Cheap asked to be left behind rather than travel as a prisoner of his own crew, and Bulkley's party, likely relieved to be rid of a man they'd have to feed and guard, agreed. On the 13th of October, 1741, 81 men crowded aboard the Speedwell and her 2 small consorts, and stood south into the worst waters on Earth. On the beach behind them stood Captain David Cheap and roughly 19 men who had chosen the king's officer over the crew's paperwork. Among them, a teenage midshipman named John Byron, whose grandson would one day become the poet Lord Byron. Both groups fully expected the other to die. What followed were 2 of the most brutal survival voyages in naval history, running in opposite directions. The Speedwell's run south reads like something out of scripture. Within weeks, the smallest boat was lost, and the barge turned back toward the island, carrying Byron and a handful of others who had thought better of the whole enterprise. The rest pressed on through the Strait of Magellan, in a decked-over longboat so crowded that men could barely shift, on rations that shrank to almost nothing. They ate seal when they could shoot it, seaweed and shellfish when they could land, and the leather of their own equipment when they could not. Men died of starvation almost daily, and went over the side without ceremony. Others were set ashore on the Patagonian coast and left, a decision the survivors would spend the rest of their lives justifying. One party of about 8 put on a beach north of the strait to hunt for food, watched the Speedwell sail on without them. Against every odds, a handful of those marooned men stayed alive for months on that coast, were taken by the Spanish, and eventually got home to tell their own furious version of the story. One more set of accusations, in a case that was drowning in them. Through all of it, Bulkley navigated. A gunner, holding a battered copy of a seaman's manual, threading a homemade boat through the Strait of Magellan and up the Atlantic coast by dead, reckoning in weather that sank proper ships. When the Speedwell finally crawled into Rio Grande on the coast of Brazil at the end of January 1742, she had covered roughly 2,500 nautical miles of the worst ocean on the planet, navigated by a gunner. Around 30 of the 81 were still alive. The men celebrated their deliverance. They shouldn't have, because in England, The story that would greet them was already curdling, and everything now depended on who told it first. Bulkeley understood that instantly. Back home in 1743, with the Admiralty eyeing him and his shipmates as probable mutineers, he did something almost unheard of for a warrant officer. He published his day-by-day journal of the wreck, the shooting of Cozzens, and the voyage of the Speedwell went into print for the British public, methodical, sober, and devastating to Captain Cheap. The Admiralty held its hand, because the only man who could formally accuse anyone was 4,000 miles away and presumed dead. He wasn't. Cheap's ordeal on the island had gone from grim to biblical. The attempt to move north in the remaining boats failed against endless headwinds and cost more lives, and the shrinking party staggered back to Wager Island to starve beside the bones of the camp. What saved the last of them was the very people the sailors had driven off. A group of Coescar, led by a man the British called Martin, agreed to guide them north through the labyrinth of channels by canoe in exchange for the barge, a piece of seamanship the Royal Navy could not have performed with a fleet. By the time the party reached Spanish territory at Kilauea, exactly 4 remained alive: Cheap, Lieutenant Hamilton of the Marines, Midshipman Campbell, and John Byron. The Spanish held them as prisoners of war, then paroled them in Santiago for years, and in 1746, after a prisoner exchange, Captain David Cheap finally stepped back onto English soil 5.5 years after he'd sailed, carrying a single burning intention: to see John Bulkeley hanged. Which brings us to the 2 claims this story is famous for, and on this channel, famous claims get tested against the record. Claim 1. This is universally called the Wager Mutiny. Books call it that. Documentaries call it that. The encyclopedia entry calls it that. Under the Articles of War, mutiny was a precisely defined capital crime, and here is what the record actually shows. No court ever convicted a single wager man of mutiny. No court ever charged one. No tribunal ever so much as ruled that a mutiny had occurred. The most famous mutiny of its era, and the mutiny itself, is legally a phantom. The name is a verdict, and it was handed down by storytellers, not by any court. Whether the arrest of a murderous captain by starving men even should count as mutiny is exactly the question a trial existed to answer. And that trial is Claim 2. The reckoning finally came on the 15th of April, 1746. A court-martial aboard the warship Prince George at Spithead, and it is remembered as the day the wager affair was judged. The real question is, what happened behind closed doors before it opened? When Bulkeley was summoned, he asked what charges Captain Cheap had laid against him, fully expecting to fight for his neck. The answer changed everything. The court would inquire into one thing only: the cause of the loss of His Majesty's ship, the Wager. The arrest of the captain sat outside the scope. So did the seizure of the boats, the abandonment, the dead of the Speedwell. So did a captain shooting an unarmed midshipman in the face. The Admiralty had drawn a line at the water's edge of Wager Island and ruled that nothing beyond it existed. I mean, think about that for a second. The most notorious breakdown of naval authority in living memory, and the Navy's own court was constructed so that it could not look at it. Why stayed off the official record? But the mechanics are visible, and the timing tells you plenty. Britain in April of 1746 was a country that needed no more bad news about its navy. The war with Spain had produced humiliations instead of glory. A Jacobite army had marched into England itself only months earlier, and the one shining naval story the public had was George Anson, home in triumph after capturing the Manila treasure galleon, hauling wagon loads of Spanish silver through London, and rising fast toward the Admiralty board itself. A full airing of the Wager affair meant putting Anson's own expedition under the lamp. The stretcher cases sent his crew, the rotten planning, the 1,300 dead, the captain who shot a midshipman. Historians who have studied the decision argue their lordships understood exactly what a mutiny trial would put on display, and chose not to display it. That reading is interpretation, not a document, so take it as the most plausible explanation, rather than a proven fact. What is documented is the outcome. The scope was cut before the first witness sat down. Then there's the question of the man with the strongest motive. Cheap, who had crossed half the world to press mutiny charges, never filed them. Contemporaries and historians point to the obvious trap. The moment he accused Bulkeley's men of mutiny, the killing of Henry Cossens came into evidence, documented, dated, and witnessed in a published journal, and the accuser stood exposed to a murder charge that could hang a post captain. His silence was a plea deal with himself. And months later, the survivor's pay argument met its quiet answer. In 1747, Parliament rewrote naval law so that shipwrecked crews remained under discipline, and in pay, after their ship was lost. Lawmakers do not close loopholes that never existed. The verdict itself took a single day. Every officer and man acquitted over the loss of the ship, except Lieutenant Baines, who was admonished for failing to report the Carpenter's sighting of land. The Wager affair produced shootings, arrests, abandonments, and around 130 dead. And the sum total of official justice was a reprimand for a missed message. Cheap kept his rank. Bulkley walked free and republished his journal as vindication. Byron grew up to be an admiral, and his island memoir became raw material for his grandson's poetry. Remember the argument those starving men made on the beach, the one that sounded like desperate sea lawyer talk. When the ship dies, the law dies with her. In the end, the Admiralty's court agreed with them in the only way that mattered. It treated everything after the sinking as a place the law could not go, not because their lordships accepted the theory, but because examining that island meant putting the Royal Navy itself on trial, its stretcher-borne crews, its murderous captain, its expedition that spent 1,300 lives to make Anson rich and famous. The only party the Wager affair ever truly convicted was the law, and Parliament quietly executed the sentence by rewriting it. Every man on that beach walked away. The word mutiny was the one thing that never survived contact with a courtroom. If you want the sea's darkest stories held up against what the records actually prove, subscribe. Because next time we follow the treasure that Anson's survivors did bring home, and the price attached to every ounce of it.